spending. So for some reason, a lot of people really enjoy having a bona fide Keynes expert come on and say, yes, Keynes would advocate deficit spending in response to whatever problem is at hand. I don't really know why people like to do this, but it's okay with me. But it's also a funny question because for most of his life, Keynes didn't think about government deficits all that much. When he married Russian ballet star Lydia Lapakova in 1925, the wedding was covered by newspapers on multiple continents and even earned a spread in Vogue magazine. But they were married in 1925, and the general theory wouldn't come out for another dozen years. My point here is not just that Keynes was very famous, of course he was, but rather that he was an extremely flexible intellectual who was respected for advancing a wide variety of ideas over the course of his career. So the most precise answer to the question, what would Keynes do, is always something like, well, it depends on which Keynes you want to ask. And that's a long roundabout way of praising Nicoletta for the topic and structure of this discussion. Because while the economic problems facing the world today are very serious, they are not the specific kind of economic problems that people so often associate with Keynes, that of a straightforward shock to aggregate demand that needs to be met with government action. I think that description applies to the broad contours of the initial public response to COVID-19. Mask mandates and vaccine requirements that have become controversial since really weren't what shut down business around the world when this got started. The pandemic did that. When my book came out in May of 2020, there weren't any formal lockdowns or government restrictions that prevented book printers from operating, but people refused to work at the printing houses. So my book promptly went out of print for 6 of the first 7 weeks after its release. And this was happening everywhere, and the initial impetus from governments to replace household incomes and maintain the flow of investment to productive activity was, I think, admirable. And to some extent, I think the focus on inflation today obscures the extent of recent material deprivation, even in rich countries like the United States. If you go back to January of 2021, 15% of American parents were reporting that their children did not have enough to eat. That's just a little over a year ago, and also about 5 times the typical rate that we see in the United States. So I don't think it's an act of decadence or excess to attack that kind of problem. I think it's a basic democratic responsibility. But of course, all that feels like a very long time ago now. Fortunately for Keynes scholars, at least, demand shocks weren't the only economic problems to which Keynes devoted his energies. I don't want to hide the political aspects of this story or my own ideological inclinations here, but I do want to emphasize that the reason we study great thinkers from the past, or at least one of the better reasons we study them, is to help us understand how they thought about the major problems of the day, not just to keep track of the solutions they proposed. So from the point of view of 21st century macroeconomics, Keynes often seems to anchor the left edge of an ideological spectrum that ends on the right with Friedrich Hayek. But Keynes was also a capital L liberal in the fullest sense of the word. He meant the praise that he showered on Hayek's road to serfdom every bit as sincerely as he did his criticisms of that incendiary book. So even folks in the audience today who loathe low interest rates and large government deficits may find some interest in the way Keynes thought about economic crisis in its many forms, or at least I hope you do. So let's go to the time machine and go back not to the Great Depression that everyone thinks about when they think about Keynes, but the 2 greatest disasters of his life. The Great War that transformed the way he thought about international politics in the British Empire, and World War II, a cataclysm that he both prophesied and spent the prime years of his life trying to prevent. In both conflicts, Keynes ran British war finance, where he spent a lot of time worrying about debt, inflation, and very large shipments of grain and iron. Figuring out how to pay for and physically obtain everything Britain needed for World War I was an extremely daunting task. And it was not one that could be easily left to markets to handle, for reasons that I think will sound immediately familiar to folks today. The world economy of 1914 was thoroughly globalized, in no small part because Britain, by far the most powerful economic actor among the various empires scrambling for territory at the time, was a tiny semi-Arctic island that had no choice but to import much of what it consumed. But after the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, the rules changed. It was all well and good to believe that free trade led to mutual prosperity, but warfare was not a mutual aid society. And the stuff that Britain typically imported was very, very important to the survival of ordinary British citizens. A list of their top imports included cotton, wool, wheat, pork, cheese, and timber. And without this stuff, British citizens literally could not clothe, house, or feed themselves, never mind equip an army. Keynes had been raised as an ardent free trader, and he remained so for several more years after the war. But his view about the capacity of the state to manage the economy changed quite a bit over the course of that war. Britain didn't stop importing. It couldn't. But it had to import from different places, and it had to coordinate its purchases with the purchases of its allies in order to keep prices down. Had the Allied governments not been governments fighting a war, but private businesses seeking to limit their costs, I think most economists today would probably describe their operations as that of a cartel. In 1915, there's a particularly funny episode where Keynes was really incensed over an Italian wheat purchase from South America that drove up prices for a subsequent purchase that Britain made. And this caused all sorts of headaches because Britain was lending money to Italy so that Italy could fund its war operations, and it couldn't lend money to Italy if it was paying that money to Argentina. In other words, the top-down management of the economy was a total mess. But it worked for Britain. Didn't really work for Germany. And the chief reason it didn't work for Germany and Austria was that the British had an extremely powerful navy, which they used to physically block imports to the Central Powers. Military historians dispute how severe the food shortages in Germany were. There are plausible estimates putting the death toll from hunger at anywhere from about 0 to hundreds of thousands. I don't want to wade into that debate. Really, I don't really have a dog in that fight, but it had a tremendous impact on the outcome of the war, whatever you think the actual numbers were. By the end of the war, German imports and exports were down about 50% from the beginning of the war. It's a huge change in a globalized economy. And I think it's an important point for the world today, because serious economic sanctions are often thought of as an alternative to violence. And that's just not the case. When you're dealing with serious economic sanctions, that is a form of violence, not an alternative to it. So I think World War I ultimately revised Keynes' beliefs about the capacity for the state to manage production and distribution. It was better at it than Keynes had believed it could be. But his overall experience ultimately reinforced most of his more orthodox opinions about the global economy and how it worked. Trade was good. Britain did better than Germany during the war precisely because it was able to do more trade, which made its war machine more efficient and its home front happier. So whatever the post-war world might look like, free trade between the victor and the vanquished would be essential to creating the prosperity necessary to rebuild Europe and maintain peace. But the mere fact of the war made Keynes revise his views about the value of trade. Prior to the war, trade for Keynes was essentially an end in itself. Like millions of other educated Westerners, Keynes took for granted the idea that trade fostered mutual understanding and cultural appreciation, in addition to whatever efficiencies it brought from production. But this combination of cultural familiarity and economic prosperity was supposed to make the world a more peaceful place. When it didn't, Keynes and many others tried to come up with a system that could. The war forced Keynes to confront the idea that trade was a means to other political ends. Britain did not reshape its political ambitions around its desire to trade with other countries, but was setting up its trading regime to accommodate its political choices. It's a key distinction, I think. There are a lot of economic critiques of the book that made Keynes an international celebrity. That book, if you're unfamiliar, is called The Economic Consequences of the Peace, and it was first published at the end of 1918 after Keynes left the fairly disastrous, I think, at least in his eyes, negotiations over the Treaty of Versailles in Paris. Whether you accept his analysis or not, and I think there are quite reasonable reasons not to accept it, although I think it is more persuasive than it's often given credit for today. But whatever you think about that analysis, his account was enormously persuasive at the time. And I think it was persuasive because it reflected much of what the diplomatic community already believed about the Treaty of Versailles, based on the prevailing economic wisdom of the prior quarter century. So even when Bernard Baruch, who was an advisor to the American President Woodrow Wilson, penned an official American rejoinder to Keynes, he didn't really dispute Keynes's analysis of the treaty itself. He instead denied that a better treaty was possible and claimed that the faults of the treaty couldn't be penned on Wilson or the Americans. And so just to give you a quick refresher, Keynes basically said that high reparations against Germany were going to be impossible to pay, and they would economically ruin the continent. And unless you wiped out all of the war debts and the reparations duties, things were never going to get better in Europe. And I think much of that account still feels intuitive today, whatever you think about the numbers. I mean, the war had been extremely expensive. It had caused extraordinary damage, and it was unreasonable to think that everything would just naturally return to growth and glory if everyone paid their debts and moved on. But the new system that Keynes concocted to save Europe was remarkably close to the laissez-faire orthodoxy of the time. He basically argued that everyone should do free trade again, with the caveat that the enormous debts created by the war would be eliminated so that countries actually had the money to spend on construction and investment and production. Instead of shipping gold off to foreign creditors, they could spend it rebuilding schools and factories. So at the end of World War I, Keynes was aiming to preserve as much as possible from the old order that had fallen apart at the outbreak of the war. His grand plan was to clear out debts and restart the system. Canceling debts, he thought, was a small price to pay, and indeed, according to Keynes, would ultimately result in a wealthier world, since real wealth was created not by financial flows, but the movement of real resources to socially productive ends. The depth of his faith in free trade made him dismiss claims about moral hazard and the like that we often hear with regard to debt cancellation. It was free trade, not financial wizardry, that was going to save the world. Now, a little earlier I mentioned Hayek, and while I think Hayek often misread other thinkers, I do think it's useful for people to understand that despite their later differences, Hayek thought very highly of the economic consequences of the peace. And I take that as evidence both that Hayek could at times be more flexible than the reputation that I think he cultivated later in life, but also evidence of the fairly modest nature of the reform program that Keynes was advancing. So much for World War I. By the end of World War II, however, Keynes had developed a completely new economic theory, and that theory rearranged his views about debts and trade and everything else. When the only economic management tool you have is the tariff, free trade seems like a pretty essential policy. But one consequence of the Keynesian revolution was the legitimation of a bunch of other new tools that rendered the efficiency gains of free trade a little less impressive. If you could create massive economic growth by taking on government debt, then the edge and efficiency from trade might not seem like such a big deal anymore. Indeed, debt itself might not seem like such a big deal if a country was becoming more prosperous and more productive by taking it on. And this was particularly true for a place like the British Empire, which could rely on politically friendly trading relations with much of the globe, even if it lost trading partners in other places by trying to protect key British industries. So, after the experience of the Depression, Keynes downgraded the importance of free international trade and upgraded the value of legal stability. He recognized that comparative advantages was a thing, of course, but he also thought that much of the real value of trade was not really about efficiency as such, but predictability. It was much better to have some set of generally agreed upon rules, even if they were kind of bad, than this kind of state of perpetual revision, default, and economic anarchy that prevailed across the 1920s and the 1930s. So the rules of the game that were negotiated for the end of the war happened at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in 1944. Although Keynes lost most of the battles he fought with the United States government at those talks, the previous intellectual triumph of the general theory meant that the types of rules under discussion were a lot more flexible for governments than those of the gold standard order that had prevailed at the turn of the century. Countries were permitted to operate their monetary and fiscal policies in just about whatever manner they liked. They could even set up tariffs under some circumstances. They could block the outflow of capital in emergencies. The IMF would stand ready to assist countries in need of temporary funds to deal with imbalances of trade, and the World Bank would invest in rebuilding the continent, a vision that was ultimately replaced by US investment from the Marshall Plan. In short, the allies of World War II did not restart the old system. They built an entirely new economic paradigm around new post-war political realities, using new techniques of economic management. So, how, if at all, does any of that apply to today? I think if we want to understand today's world through the eyes of John Maynard Keynes, the question to ask is whether our current historical moment is more like 1918 or like 1944. Do we need some technical reforms and a robust, renewed commitment to the economic program of the last generation? That's what Keynes basically advised in The Economic Consequences of the Peace. Or do we need to build a new global economic paradigm, as Keynes helped to do at Bretton Woods? I don't think the answer to that question is obvious, but I myself lean toward the latter response, and I'll explain why. For much of the past year, economists have been arguing about whether governments spent too much and ran the economy too hot during its efforts to keep consumers and creditors and businesses afloat in 2020 and 2021. I think at this point, it's pretty clear that demand is running very high, at least in the United States. But I think it's equally clear that we won't be rid of the inflation problem until supply chains have been cleaned up. Excess demand may or may not be exacerbating inflation caused by production shortages, but the production shortages are the root problem. So when Nicoletta first reached out to me about this event, I thought my focus was going to be on this sort of tricky process of onshoring and supply chain resiliency that was mostly going to be a private sector event. There are a lot of companies in the US who are bringing manufacturing work back to the United States. It's happening slowly, piecemeal, but it is a thing that's going on, and that's relatively new after the last 25 or so years. And I thought that was going to be a really interesting thing to talk about, how this had pretty serious implications for the reorganization of the global economy. But in the intervening weeks, of course, Vladimir Putin began his monstrous invasion of Ukraine. I'm not going to mince words about how I feel about that. The sheer hostility of the act and Putin's open appeal to the imperial grandeur of the czars to justify a murderous campaign against maternity wards and children's hospitals leaves the rest of the world with very few morally compelling options. For my part, I think it's really hard to imagine the economic sanctions against Russia being lifted. And even if some agreement is reached in which they formally come to an end, I think investors are not going to simply flock back to Russia overnight. And I don't think the nations of Europe and the United States can plausibly remain dependent on Russian resources anymore. In every conceivable endgame, Germany and Eastern Europe will eventually wean themselves off of Russian energy. And after Putin's very public and explicit declaration of brutality, I think doing otherwise would be pretty insane. So what all this means, I think, and as I'm sure it's occurred to all of you, is that scarcity in the global economy is about to become a much bigger problem even than it has been over the past year. In addition to energy, Russia extracts large amounts of base metals and chemicals that go into everything from heavy manufacturing to agricultural fertilizer. Transitioning Western economies away from Russian resources can go a lot of different ways, but it will definitely take time and it will definitely involve very real upfront costs. Additional public debt in that environment can be good if it's used to help pay to resolve these transitional costs. A different set of transitional costs than we were talking about a year ago, I think much higher costs. The world's going to need a lot more investment to replace the resources that it's losing from Russia. And that investment won't just materialize from the gumption and daring do of rugged entrepreneurs. Governments are going to have to incentivize and direct it. Some people are going to need to be paid to do this. But debt in this environment can also be bad, obviously. If it's used as a rationale for governments not to make the necessary investments in a prosperous and peaceful future. My own view is that the fundamental problems of the next few years are not going to be about the debts themselves, how these problems could reverberate through financial markets or moral hazard or any of the things that we talked about around 2008. But really, we're talking about rerouting the global trading order. It's a really, really big change. And the global trading order needs not only to be sort of protected against shocks like the pandemic and public health problems, but against some pretty obvious political risks that exist in the world now. I don't think we're going to be talking about too much debt or too much demand in a couple of years. I think we'll be talking about too little supply and ineffective coordination. Those are problems, but they are problems that can be solved, even if they're a little rough in their solutions. It's time for countries to coordinate their diplomacy not only against Russia, but to negotiate a new trading order where Europe and the United States, at least, are able to maintain prosperity without relying on resources from strongmen bent on waging world wars. What kind of international order is possible is a really difficult question at any moment. At this moment, I think the politics are in flux, and it's really hard to say how this goes. Russia is not the only country that made a major miscalculation with the invasion of Ukraine. I think it's pretty clear that Xi Jinping miscalculated as well. This invasion came just a couple weeks after a very public declaration of the undying friendship between Moscow and Beijing. We know that China had foreknowledge that Putin would be invading. And we also know that China requested that Putin delay the attacks until the Beijing Olympics had concluded. Either Beijing misunderstood the extent of the operation Putin was planning, or misunderstood the Western backlash, miscalculated what the Western backlash would be, or both. But either way, in the weeks since the invasion began, China has been very careful. They clearly don't want to lose the trading links with Europe that they've taken a long time to establish, and which are much bigger than China's trading relationship with Russia. But they've also been rhetorically denouncing the United States and parroting Russian propaganda about the invasion. These are not the actions of a responsible global steward at the moment, but China is also clearly uncomfortable with this position. And I think it's really hard to say how they may change course. And I think it's really hard to structure a new global paradigm around an economy as large as China when what they're going to do is unknown. But unfortunately, I think we're kind of running out of time to act. The political climate in the United States has improved somewhat recently, but it's still not very good. The last president of the United States tried to blackmail Zelensky as a favor to Putin, and his entire political party in Congress, with the exception of Mitt Romney, voted to support that act. I don't think that kind of openly pro-Putin behavior will be politically possible in the United States anytime soon, but building a new economic order is really hard, and I think it's only going to get harder if Biden is out of office in a couple of years. So I think we can talk about possible options here in a discussion section. My final point before I turn it over to Doug is that in economics and politics, we tend to talk as if the progressive pursuit of egalitarian social goals is this risky thing, while conservative programs that accept the status quo are sound acts of prudence. And I don't think that's what describes the options available to us today. The question is really a matter of what constitutes prudence. I think a strict adherence to the economic norms of 1999 in today's world would not be prudent, but reckless. And what we owe to future generations is not just an accounting ledger with a reasonable or no debt, but a world where a decent life is available. It doesn't do the children of today any good to be free of debt if their parents are out of work and their cities are in flames. So this is how Keynes saw things when he read Hayek's Road to Serfdom. He read the book when he was on his way to Bretton Woods, and he had some very nice things to say about it. In my opinion, it is a grand book, Keynes wrote. We all have the greatest reason to be grateful to you for saying so well what needs so much to be said. You will not expect me to accept quite all the economic dicta in it, but morally and philosophically, I find myself in agreement with virtually the whole of it. And not only in agreement, but a deeply moved agreement. So his objection was not to Hayek's end, but to his means of reaching that end. He was talking as one liberal to another. A change in our economic programs, the New Deal or the Beveridge Plan, would lead only in practice to disillusion with the results of your philosophy. So if liberalism was to survive, it would have to adapt to the realities of the day. And so it is in our time. Thanks.
Thank you, Zach. This was really a wonderful journey again through Keynes' thought and the evolution of his thought as events change. I think there was a query whether the quote, when facts change, I change my mind, is attributable to Keynes or to Churchill. But certainly a lot of things happened during the years that Keynes was an active contributor to British economic policy. He only lived 62 years, but he made a tremendous dent also to subsequent public policy decisions around the world, and certainly the IMF itself. Thank you for your views on current events and the intertwining of supply shocks and demand shocks. I would like to go now to Doug. Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Let me introduce him briefly. He's currently president of the American Action Forum Policy Institute. He was formerly an economics professor at Syracuse University and director of the Congressional Budget Office and chief economic policy advisor to Senator John McCain, 2008 presidential campaign. I must open a parenthesis here. I was on for some years during the GFC crisis in the North American division, and I became a total fan of the CBO. I mean, I devoured the reports, and I was an incredibly sophisticated intellectual elite that this country has. And so I'm very honored to have you, Doug. I would like to bring the discussion a little bit back on, the issue of, fiscal spending today and where we are. And
Sure.
We know that some, including the IMF, have argued that the large spending was for COVID was inevitable to minimize economic scarring. I think Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell described it this way. He said, huge borrowing by governments and corporations during the pandemic served as a bridge across the economic chasm of lockdowns, plunging consumer spending, idle cruise ships, vacant hotels, and millions of lost jobs. So it was really like a way to support on a heart-lung machine economies that have been, consciously shut down for a number of months or quarters, or some actually even years. All this spending, however, is kind of scaring, and it's a reason for concern. And also, there's a sense in which, among commentators, the issues are not just the fact that debt surges amplify vulnerabilities, especially as financial conditions tighten, but also fosters inflation, and it damages economic prospects for future generations. I think the thinking of what this spending might do going forward for decades has been maybe underestimated, certainly in the commentaries that I've seen. But I know that you are, together with other, icons like Larry Summers and Christina Romer, people have been critical of the size of the shock, not much the fact that debt had to be generated, unfortunately, but of the size of it. So if you could tell us a bit about, I know you wrote about the American Rescue Plan, and you had a view of that, a critical view of that, and the size. If you could, spend some time elaborating on that, especially in the United States, would be very great.
I'm delighted to have the chance to join you, and I am troubled to have to follow someone as thoughtful and eloquent as Zachary. So it's just not fair. But I will do my best. As a slight preface, I want to say that I had been thinking a lot about the tools of macroeconomic stabilization prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, because 20th century recessions in the US especially were income-related events, and the conventional demand management tools that are attributed to Keynes and come from his legacy are really focused on aggregate demand, and they were all the things that politicians were comfortable with. And then the 21st century gave us, first in the US, an equity bubble called the dot-com bubble, which collapsed and caused a mild real economy recession in the early 2000s. And we deployed those demand management tools on a repeated basis. This is when I was in the White House, with very little success. It was referred to as the jobless recovery, even though we did things in 2002, 2003, 2005. And then when the Great Recession came, that was the aftermath of a huge financial shock, in this case, a debt bubble, subprime mortgages in particular. And we had the recovery, which everyone complained about how slow and unsatisfactory it was, despite the fact that, again, we deployed the very same tools to the best of our ability. So I had been worrying that somehow we were stuck with outdated tools for modern recessions, and that we ought to be thinking about this a bit. And then COVID-19 happens, and I think there's a mixed legacy of the responses, and I want to be real clear about that. I think the initial response, especially in the United States, the CARES Act, was remarkably appropriate and successful. Almost always the critique of fiscal policy is that it arrives too late. It's not, they don't move quickly enough, and they don't design it right. It hits at the wrong point in the cycle. The CARES Act was passed in March of 2020 and hit exactly at the time the U.S. economy needed help. And the U.S. economy contracted by nearly 10% in the second quarter of 2020. The CARES Act was a 10% of GDP fiscal stimulus. And there are lots of reasons to think that it wasn't technically designed right, because I think the most important point Zach made is this is closer to a wartime situation. This is physical disruption of the capacity to undertake commerce. That's the most important aspect of COVID-19. And at the moment they did the CARES Act, they didn't appreciate that. They didn't think about it that way. They simply literally threw money at the problem using the things that they understood. They sent checks and unemployment insurance, all these income replacement policies that we have as the acceptable toolkit. So that I still think was worth it because the public needed for the government to act in a visible large-scale way to a visible large-scale threat. But from that point forward, the failure to genuinely diagnose the nature of the COVID-19 disruption, I think, really led to a lot of highly ineffectual spending and debt incurred without great ability to show something for it. To my eye, COVID-19 reminded me enormously of the terrorist attacks in 2001 on September 11th, when we suddenly woke up and realized that there was a threat to the US population and that the threat must be dealt with. In this case, we needed a public health mission that would be effective in dealing with the threat of COVID-19. And we needed a way to operate the economy in the face of that threat. In post 9/11, that was things like inspecting all the containers, international trade, and things like that. We needed a way to do the things, vaccinations, therapeutics, masks, social distancing, that were short of lockdown and allowed the economy to operate. And we didn't quickly get to that. In fact, in many cases, we didn't get there at all, and instead tried to solve it with just throwing money at the problem, literally. We did it at the end of 2020, $900 billion, and especially the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 trillion in March of 2021. That's simply a major policy error in my view. And it was a knowable, it was a known policy error, I think. I testified at the time that is not a good idea. From a macro stabilization point of view, number one, it came at the wrong time. The US economy was growing at 6.5% at the time the act was signed into law. All the real-time data suggested that. The GDP estimate later turned out to be about exactly that. So this is not a time when you need fiscal stimulus. That's superb growth. It was way too big. My old shop, the Congressional Budget Office, regularly puts out an estimate of potential GDP. You can look at actual GDPs, figure out the size of the output gap. The output gap was something like $400 to $600 billion at the end of 2020. It was a $2 trillion stimulus. You shouldn't need $2 trillion to close that output gap. So it was really badly oversized, and it was really poorly designed. Whatever you might have thought of the CARES Act, it got money into the household sector, it got people to be unemployed, it kept the small business infrastructure afloat. There was a design there that made some sense. Once we got to the fall of 2020 in the United States, if you looked at the very micro data, it was clear that in low-income zip codes, spending had returned to above February levels, so it had recovered from whatever pandemic diminishment there had been. It was also true for middle-income zip codes. What was missing in the U.S. economy was spending in high-income zip codes on services that involve personal contact. The affluent weren't taking vacations, they weren't going to shows, they weren't going out to dinner and to restaurants, and there was nothing about the American Rescue Plan that was going to produce that response. They had money, wealth had risen in 2020, income had risen in 2020, so the plan was really genuinely not going to do anything. All it did was engender inflation, and I think it's real. I think the case is clear that we can blame the American Rescue Plan for a substantial portion of the U.S. inflation problem. If you look at consumer price inflation in Europe, in the European area, and in the U.S., European inflation goes up about 1 percentage point each quarter last year. That's the global supply problems. That's the production shortfalls. That's all the supply chain. The U.S. Goes up just like Europe in the first quarter, and immediately after that, with the arrival of the stimulus, it goes up 3 times that in the second quarter. It's just a huge demand shock. That ultimately the consumer price increases over 6 percentage points last year. That the last time we got that in the United States was 1974 with the supply shock, and the other time we got that was 1951 when, remarkably, in an economy that was growing at 10.5%, we raised federal spending by 50% to fight the Korean War. That's over stimulus, and so I think we've got a combination of those two things going on now. And the American Rescue Plan ultimately will produce inflation, not any growth, and will have been $2 trillion that we wasted. Let me close by just saying, I had hoped that the experience of fighting COVID-19 and these enormous sums, $6 trillion total for the fiscal side, about $4.8 trillion in balance sheet expansion by the Federal Reserve, would cause everyone to pause and reflect on the fact that we already had, coming into the pandemic, an unsustainable fiscal outlook in the United States. And as a result, we had pre-committed enormous amounts of our fiscal wherewithal in the absence of any sort of emergency. And that maybe this would engender a discussion that says we shouldn't put ourselves in a position where we might have so much debt already and inability to fight these large-scale disasters. It hasn't done that, but I'm hoping this call will be a rallying cry for everybody to start thinking about putting the trajectory of the U.S. and other large developed countries on a more stable path so that they have the internal wherewithal to deal with our problems, and as I think Zachary has correctly identified, the external wherewithal to deal with a new world that's going to be very different than we had before. I'll just close there.
Thanks, Doug. We have our Fiscal Monitor, October 2021, which is the latest with big numbers. We have one coming up for, of course, the spring meetings. Says and shows that it will take at least a decade to go back to debt levels, pre-pandemic debt levels, and that will require huge fiscal surpluses, which of course will entail taxation, the usual fiscal cycle. So do you think, just as a follow-up on what you just said about inflation and demand shock, that the inflation that is being generated as part of this stimulus is going to dent debt sufficiently to kind of ease the pain of reining in debt going forward, or you think it's going to be something?
I think if we take John Powell at his word, he quite forcefully made the case yesterday that over the next 3 years, he would return inflation in the United States to the Fed's 2% target. That will, I think, almost by definition, mean a much more aggressive response than what people had initially thought. We're not going to see 6 quarter-point increases. We're going to see a much sharper increase in interest rates. So I don't think there will be enough long-lived high inflation to change the debt burden very much. It's going to go away quickly. Instead, my fear is there is always the risk that in attempting to do that, the Fed slows growth too dramatically, and we'll get a panicky response to what appears to be the onset of recession, and that will be a step in the wrong direction. So I think we're in a very perilous moment, to be honest.
And the war, of course, is raging with the sanctions.
Yes. The downside risks from Ukraine, and I have on my worry list China, which appears to have essentially no effective vaccine and a highly transmissible Omicron variant coursing through its population. That's a big risk to a big economy. This is not a moment where I have enormous confidence in the outlook.
Right. Don't we all? I would like to move to Europe, which is another area of, I should say, concern at the moment in terms of outlook for a number of reasons. And to talk about Europe, I've invited Francesco Saraceno. So Francesco is the Deputy Department Director of the Observatoire Français de Conjoncture Économique, the Economic Research Center of Sciences Po in Paris. He teaches international macro and is Academic Director of the Sciences Po Northwestern University on European affairs. And I've asked him if he can to discuss same pandemic-related fiscal spending in the EU and possibly reflect upon the ways we can deal with the very much increased European Union and especially European Monetary Union debt. And I think he has some very interesting analysis that he's done, and he can debrief us on that. Francesco, the floor is yours. He has some slides as well. I think you want to share them.
I have some slides. Can you see them?
Not yet. Now, yes.
You know, I cannot see you. Okay.
I can see this. We can see the slides. At least I can.
Okay. So, Beth, thank you very much for the invitation. I decided to devote my 10 minutes to try to sort a little bit the actual debate, the current debate on the debt legacy. So not so much on what we did so far, because what we did so far was quite similar to other countries, to other advanced economies. There is, of course, there was less proactive fiscal policy, so we don't have the same type of inflation, of demand-driven inflation that is emerging in the United States, but more or less, from a qualitative point of view, we did move more or less in the same directions as the other countries. But on the other hand, we have the same legacy of debt, and we have the complication that in Europe, of course, we don't have a single fiscal policy, but we have at least 19 Eurozone fiscal policies and just one single monetary policy. So we have now raging in Europe the debate on how to manage these 19 fiscal policies through adapted fiscal rules, and on the other, how to deal with the debt legacy. So this is what I will try to give you some insights on. Let me start by the lessons of the crisis. The lesson of the crisis is that we cannot imagine that the single currency works without having proactive macroeconomic policies, meaning both fiscal and monetary policies. The two crises we had in 10 years, the sovereign debt crisis, and the COVID crisis, showed that the exclusive reliance on market mechanisms to absorb this type of shocks cannot work. And what has emerged, and it kind of came out also from the previous from two previous discussions, is that there is a very important role for macroeconomic policy, or fiscal policy in particular, through both industrial policy and public investment in fostering long-term growth and the structural transformation of the economy. We all know that this difficult decade comes on top of a long-run challenge, which is the challenge of ensuring environmental sustainability of our economies. The other lesson we got from the crisis is that there is no such thing as an asymmetrical shock. And all shocks are asymmetrical in their effect. They can be symmetrical in their nature, but they have a differential impact on different countries. So when discussing the issue of fiscal space, we need to make sure that individual countries have the room for reacting to the idiosyncratic consequences of the shocks, whether these shocks are common or not. And the other lesson that we got from the COVID crisis, and this is of course something that in a federal state like the United States is a non-issue, is a no-brainer, but that in an institutional setup like the monetary union, the European Monetary Union, was a serious news, if you want, something that we didn't know before, we should have known before, but we didn't, is that if we have a common response, if we share the response to shocks, even if this response is differentiated, that works much better. That was the purpose of the Next Generation EU program, which is the 5 years investment plan that we have put together, which is much smaller in size than the different recovery plans of the United States, but still quite significant, and it is, from an institutional point of view, quite a big innovation. And that Next Generation EU program also taught another lesson that was, once again, seems self-evident outside of Europe, but it's not self-evident here in Europe, is that if you frame solidarity in a proper framework, then that can be accepted even by the so-called frugal countries that are very skeptical of their southern neighbors. And so all of these lessons are now in some sense present in the discussion we're having on what to do next and how to reform Europe in face of these crises. The second premise I wanted to do is that the European construction, as it is today on paper, is something that it really seems a relic from a different era. It's really something that is completely at odds with the needs that the last decade has shown. First of all, we have very strong constraint on the national fiscal policies. Second, we have a monetary policy that is exclusively geared towards controlling inflation. So it has a very strong inflation targeting mandate, and it's quite independent in doing that. Last but not least, Europe, as it is today, has no room for industrial policy. Our definition, if you want, of industrial policy in Europe is that you need to have a level playing field. So there is an identification of industrial policy with competition policy. What has been happening in the past few months or years is that, in fact, we had massive intervention of fiscal policies, both to cope with the pandemic and to restart the economy through the Next Generation EU program I was mentioning before. There has been massive monetary support to fiscal policies. Since 2015, the ECB has been at least as expansionary as the Fed in the United States, and that was particularly true during the pandemics with the new purchase program for pandemic purchases. Last but not least, the whole Next Generation EU program puts at the center of the stage the public investment, and public investment targeted towards sectors that are considered to be a priority. So public investment at the service, if you want, of industrial policy. So the big challenge of these next few years will be to realign what is on paper and what we've been doing in practice. So to consolidate, in some sense, the innovations that we had in the macroeconomic policy field. And I think that we should have three objectives when we rethink the European institutions. First, and I will be very short on that because it's kind of a side note from my speech, we should embed in the European institutions this newfound sense of solidarity. If we learn that, if we frame it correctly, solidarity can be one policy tool, then that should be better organized, because as of now, it is not at all organized in the European institutions. Second and third, which are quite related, of course, is that we need to make sure that the future institutions guarantee some fiscal space for both either countries or the central fiscal capacity to be built, and that should be both for short and long-term policy objectives. At the same time, this fiscal space should be ensured by making sure that the stability of public finances and of financial market is not endangered. And I will be mostly focused on these last two points. And of course, these three objectives should, and this is one big flaw I see in the current state of the European debate, these three objectives should be actually considered as a whole, and we should avoid thinking piecewise and having a partial equilibrium perspective, because how we solve each of these objectives, how you get to each of these three objectives, of course, affects the others. And this is something that is really missing in our debate today. For the organization of solidarity among EU countries, I mean, I will then give to Nicoletta the slide so you can see that. I refer you to this quite interesting paper by Lucas Gutenberg that came out in 2020, and basically his idea was to take all of the different assistance lines and financial assistance that we have, entities that we have in Europe, and basically organize them under a single hat, and so having them into a single institution, European agency that would perform this financial assistance with dedicated credit line for different purposes. And of course, the conditionalities attached to this financial assistance would then be made also contingent to the different purposes. The non-Europeans don't know that in Europe we had a long-lasting debate on the reasons why the ESM pandemic line, so the ESM dedicated line to cover health-related expenditure was a total failure. No country actually asked the money, and the bottom line of that is that was a poorly designed instrument, and so we should be very careful in how to frame this new facility. Going to how to create fiscal space, I will not enter in these few minutes into the many proposals that are being discussed right now on better fiscal rules for Europe, let me just give you some basic principles of what we should do. First of all, we should have that debate on fiscal rules not being, once again, disconnected from the debate on whether we should have a central fiscal capacity, because how much we want to constrain subnational entities is very much connected and related to how much the central capacity is developed. And think of the United States, where most states, all states but one, have very strong budget constraints, but this is of course possible because there is a very strong fiscal capacity at the center. So how restrictive we want the rules to be depends on how much we are willing to go on in creating a central fiscal capacity. Second, there is a very strong consensus in Europe right now that we need to protect public investment. And so there is a strong consensus that we should have some sort of a golden rule that excludes from deficit computations what is spent for investment. In particular, there is a quite interesting proposal that we should eliminate and scrap from the Stability Pact all the green transition related expenditure. The problem is that most attempts to quantify that type of rule show that this would not really increase the fiscal space of member countries. So we risk having a rule that is, of course, good in principle, but will not substantially change the way countries can actually face the challenges of the next few years. Furthermore, I think that is now very clear, I mean, the pandemics made it very clear that the definition of investment should not be an accounting definition. We should not think of investment as just tangible assets, but we should also have intangible assets to be considered. I think very few people today would argue against the idea that health-related expenditure, be it current or investment, is good for human capital accumulation and so should be somehow protected. And so we should think of some sort of augmented golden rule in which there is a political determination by the Council and the Commission and by the European institutions of what should be considered a priority for growth in the long run, be it tangible or intangible capital. And so something that goes in the direction of widening the scope of investment, not of reducing it. The last topic that is important, of course, and is very much related to the subject of today's discussion, is that we need to find a way to manage the huge stock of debt that these two crises between 2010 and 2020 have left behind. The context is the framework is very different than it was a few years ago. Now there is many, think, for example, of the Blanchard American Economic Association address in 2019, many today emphasize the fact that we should move away from solvency towards the idea of sustainability. We have that growth is globally higher than interest rates, and it's probably bound to remain so, even if, of course, monetary policy is going to be restrictive. We just heard Doug explaining why this will happen. We know that states do not have to repay principal in principle because they are perpetual, so the sustainability is guaranteed by the capacity to service the debt. And so solvency in this context of low interest rates is globally not an issue. Nevertheless, and this comes the European specificity, the fact that it's not a global issue doesn't mean that it cannot be an issue for an individual country. I'm Italian, you can guess which country I'm thinking about. A high debt and low growth country like Italy, of course, it needs to be very careful in its management of public finances because the issue of sustainability might be quite serious. There has been some discussion on having the ECB basically keep in its books this excessive stock of debt and just forget it for forever. That, of course, is a feasible option. The idea that that would lead to fiscal dominance is not particularly warranted because as long as this is an autonomous choice by the ECB, of course, there is no risk of credibility lost by the ECB. The problem is that if the ECB has an inflated balance sheet, it will be harder for it to actually focus on its core business, which is to close the output gap and, more importantly, to close the inflation gap. So of course, it's an option, but I'm not sure it would be the best possible option. And so what we tried to do with a few colleagues in the past few months has been to develop the idea of managing the EMU debts collectively, but outside the ECB. That would have many benefits. We would have the creation of a safe asset that is missing in Europe, and of course it's quite important. We could have that it would increase the fiscal space because it would decrease the liquidity risk for individual countries, and as I said before, it would take the burden off the shoulders of the ECB. To have that solution, of course, we need to have, to have a politically feasible solution, we need to have some very careful design, because we need that management to avoid debt mutualization, because in some European countries, debt mutualization is seen as basically a free lunch for indisciplined countries and for profligate countries, and that is, of course, that would give no political space to the proposal. We need to avoid eliminating all fundamental risks, so to absorb the risk on behalf of the countries, because that, of course, would lead to moral hazard. And last but not least, we need these agencies not to increase instability, financial instability, by introducing juniority effects. Some debt is managed by the agency and some is not, and that would create, of course, possible problems of stability. And that is the idea behind this proposal that was in a paper that came out a few months ago by Massimo Amato and some co-authors, and on which I've been working more recently together with Massimo. And I repeat, what we have been working on is to make sure that these three conditions that you see on the screen are guaranteed, so that we have the political feasibility. And the idea, to make it very short, is that there will be loans to member states that would be made by this agency, that would finance these loans by issuing bonds that would, of course, be AAA bonds, and that would progressively, so the agency would progressively absorb all the debt and substitute it with loans, and so that would filter the refinancing and liquidity risk. On the other side, the interest, so the payment on these loans would depend, the interest on these loans would depend on the assessment of the fundamental risk that would remain in the hands of the European Commission, so it would not be given to the agency, and that would make sure that the fiscal accountability is guaranteed and that there is no risk sharing, and so countries cannot use the agency to free ride on other countries. The technical details are on the paper. Of course, I will not waste your time on that. And the benefits of that agency would be that, first of all, it could work with either rules or with a fiscal central capacity that is completely neutral to the function of the agency, that it would perform this division of task I was mentioning before. The ECB would be freed from this debt, and so it could resort to its core business, and there will be also a very clear division of tasks between the agency and the Commission. The agency would simply apply interest rates based on a political assessment by the Commission about how disciplined are the countries and how high is the fundamental risk. So that assessment would remain as it is today with the Commission and the Council. And of course, the creation of such an agency by creating a safe asset would also stabilize financial markets. I stop here, and it was a little bit long at the end, but I'm sorry.
Francesco, that was very, very insightful and very provocative, almost innovative. I haven't had time myself to dwell too much on those papers, but I'll definitely have a look. I just wanted to, I don't see questions for the moment in the chat. We have very few minutes left. And I just wanted to come back to all of you, whoever's interested among the speakers to pick it up, and maybe Doug. We are, now talking, Francesco mentioned the servicing the debt is now the issue, not the solvency. And it kind of looks like a very strange word from the perspective of a more traditional economist. We're also talking about digital currencies, central bank digital currencies. These, of course, are related phenomena to some extent, which could, alleviate issues because tax revenues might become more certain, but at the same time, might create all sorts of capital flow issues that we are currently studying and aware of, and other issues. But from the perspective of the IMF, the path is almost that of, remaining on a sustainable debt directory, and that people have been talking about the need to debt restructure, in either some advanced economies or other emerging economies that might find themselves in a situation of not being able to honor their debt. And Francesco is saying this is not a global issue. Solvency is not a global issue, but then since there's a staggering in the problem and the manifestation of the problem, it can become a global spillover issue if things don't happen all at once. I mean, the tide can lift all boats. If we all have higher debt, you can redenominate everybody's debt, I guess, and get like a monopoly game instead of agreement. But I don't think it's as simple as that, because of course there are countries that print money, which are globally accepted, countries that don't. So what's your take on that in a couple of minutes? Your like on the feet reaction to this open waters economics.
I would say three things very quickly. Number one, this notion of focusing on debt sustainability, it strikes me as not particularly ambitious, right? Unsustainability is a disaster. Avoiding disaster is not the same thing as doing well. Which brings me to point number two. It matters why you are incurring the debt and why you're sustaining the debt. And that's the nature of the underlying public finances. And in the US, we have an underlying system which has, prior to the pandemic, subsidized consumption at the expense of saving, investment, and growth. And that over the long term is a disservice to the next generations. In the pandemic, as I said, I think we incurred a lot of debt that we didn't need to, with really ineffectual responses. So a lot of Francesco's ending is about how do you look through the debt to make sure that you're appropriately assessing what it's being used for, and that ultimately is very important. And then the third thing I would say is there's a big difference in my view between looking at these various sustainability indicators like nominal debt service relative to nominal GDP, real versus real, versus having those as targets or controls. I think it's a very bad idea to have something that has an interest rate in it as a target or control, because you don't control that. That is going to be set by global capital markets, and it can change quickly, and you can get volatility into the underlying fiscal policies from using that as a target. And so I would advise against that. I know debt to GDP isn't as appealing to some people, but you at least control the debt. That is something you control. And you want to focus on things you can actually control and which are responsive to policymakers' decisions. And so I'm a little concerned about this sort of sustainability discussion at the moment, because I think it's missing the key thing, which is what are the underlying public finances, and I think it might be using an inappropriate target for effective policymaking.
Yes, I'll have to think about all this. Maybe we need another meeting. Francesco, I'll give you the word for a second, but just I want to go back to Zach for literally a minute or two. And this discussion reminded me of your book, when your book talks about German reparation debts, and how it took about 92 years for Germany to repay its debt. And of course, they were so heavy, and Keynes was so much opposed to it because they then led to geopolitical instability. The humiliation of such high debt toll was, really, in his view as well, one of the reasons why we went into a second wave of conflict. And do you have, are you optimistic or pessimistic about, geopolitical situation with this avalanche of debt, or the fact that we all have debt now? It's like it kind of alleviates the individual problems. It's forgetting about the current wars going on in the world. There are many.
It's hard to say whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic at this moment. I think I do have sort of an optimistic just pattern of thought, which is one reason why I find Keynes such a compelling historical figure. He's always seeing the bright side of things, often to his own political detriment. I have to say, this is like the bleak. I agree with Doug. This is about like the bleakest time I can really imagine macroeconomically, at least in my lifetime. Bleakest time I can remember. I guess I think one of the important aspects about this debt, I also agree with what Doug said about how it's important to focus on what the debt is used for, although I think I have a different judgment about some of the more recent spending, in that, you know, in order to do the investment, where I agree with Doug, that's the real key to all of this. And I think it's the key to dealing with, you know, the future sort of trade and supply shocks that are going to come from China and Russia. I mean, if you look at how bad gas prices are now, I mean, my God, in 3 or 4 months, they're going to be even worse. Right now, energy demand is unusually low because so much of China's manufacturing sector is in lockdown. So everything in the short term is going to get much worse, I think. But politically, you do need, you know, in democracies where people vote, the political system has to make people feel like they count and they are included in the decisions that are being made. And so I was very concerned when they did the initial CARES Act, where once again, I agree with Doug, it was a really good bill. But at the time, I was really concerned that there wasn't going to be enough spending on households, that money was going to run out. People were still going to be in pretty bad shape by the end of the year, and they were going to be screaming about how terrible it was that we had bailed out, you know, every business in America rather than letting them all just collapse in a fire, and that there would be a lot of political upheaval as a result. And so I don't think it's the case that we've totally wasted a lot of that spending, because we didn't have that kind of really intense political upheaval. I know it's a low bar to clear, but, you know, things like child poverty in the United States went down by like 40% over the first 9 months of last year. You know, that however bad things are politically in the United States right now, I think they'd be worse if that hadn't happened. So I do think part of the policy program has to take into account the political realities for where countries are. And if that means creating some extra inflation, you know, it would be a better world. We wouldn't have that. But, you know, some inflation is going to be part of the story no matter what we do. The question is whether we let it get to like disastrous levels. So with regard to what we do on debt, you know, I thought Francesco's presentation was really fascinating. You know, to me, investment is the big story. The debt is a sort of secondary narrative. And if you can run a high demand economy and get a lot of investment, a lot of private investment from high demand, you know, that's one way to get more investment. But, you know, more coordination about what to do with debts, or more coordination about how to reorganize trade flows and the movement of resources can do that too. But the coordination is really hard, as we've seen over the past year. And I think it only gets harder and more expensive from here. The final point, and then I'll let it go. You know, I think the focus on debt and fiscal stuff sometimes makes us forget the extent to which investment is part of the prudence calculation. You know, you want to leave fiscal space for your economy. It seems like common sense prudence. But if you don't invest enough, you get problems down the road. I think the situation with Germany right now is really interesting. They've been fiscally very responsible for the last decade or so. But if you take into account depreciation on net, public investments down for the last decade. And where does that leave them when you have the Ukraine crisis? I mean, they've got plenty of fiscal space, but they're dependent on Russian gas and Russian oil. So they're not actually in a particularly safe situation, and their decisions are constrained by you know, what looks to me in retrospect like a reckless lack of investment. So whatever the world's leaders do over the next few years, I mean, I think that the really key trick here is to get everybody on the same page about accelerating investment, so that shocks like this are not as severe when they arrive.
Thank you, Zach. Very thoughtful insights there. Again, I share those views. Francesco, very quick comeback to Doug's points and Zach's points, and then we close.
Very, very quick. I actually agree. There is one one positive lesson, I think, from the episodes of fiscal consolidation of the past. Now there is a much higher awareness than before that not all public spending is good, and that we need to be very selective in the way we design our public finances. This is something that is now pretty much, I mean, there can still be mistakes. Doug seems to think that there were made many mistakes in the reaction to the crisis. Let's not forget that we were kind of in a frantic moment, so many mistakes were also made because we were working on the urgency. So I think that is quite good, and I think it's also quite strong, the feeling that we need to protect public investment. And this comes to the issue of dealing with that, okay? The past experience shows that episodes of sharp fiscal consolidation mostly impact public investment rather than current expenditure. So one way to protect public investment, among other things, is to carefully manage, especially the stock of the legacy and the debt, the legacy debt that we have, and that was that is much of the actually zest of the current discussion in Europe. We have two different issues. First, how to organize our way of doing public finances. Second, how to deal with that. And luckily, I would say, many people seem to think today that cutting debt through primary surpluses is not necessarily a good idea, because that would impact, in the end, investment. This has always been the case, and there is no reason why that would be different right now. One very last, almost provocative reaction to what Doug said: targeting interest expenditure, in some sense, could be seen as a way to ensure that you have fiscal discipline. Because if you target interest expenditure, then you need to convince markets that they don't need to panic, and so that they need to keep buying your debt. So if you manage to convince markets, then you will have interest rates that remain manageable, and you will be able to target interest. So targeting interest expenditure would be a way to take into account the disciplining role of markets on public finances. But I know, I mean, I'm being a little bit provocative here.
I would like to thank you. I learned a lot, and I have not been left with more questions than answers. I think it's one of these seminars where I have some answers, and that's good, and certainly some perspectives from you. The future is definitely a challenge, but I think it's good that we can start scratching the surface of what lies ahead, and try to make the most and leverage on our experiences, including from the great Keynes, thanks to Zachary, and also a reflection about how to what we can learn from previous crises in Europe and how to manage our fiscal rules, and also from the past and the many analyses that CBO has done, and about who will pay and how all this avalanche of debt in the United States. And I think Doug gave extremely useful remarks on the quality of expenditure and the focus that the public spender has to have when he goes about with such big programs. So I wait you for the next seminar, the next webinar. We haven't set a date yet, but I thank you immensely for being here, for illuminating us, and I think it's time for lunch. Bye. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.